CEO Celeste Wycliffe owed Jonah Keene $2 million, but instead of cutting a check, she handed the single father an abandoned junkyard and a bill for hazardous waste cleanup. Celeste smiled when Jonah signed, certain she had converted a debt into a bankruptcy sentence. 14 days later, 5 convoys of luxury vehicles rolled through the yard's rusted gates. 5 billionaires stepped out onto cracked asphalt, each wanting something buried beneath mountains of corroded steel. When the opening bid reached $99 million, Celeste finally understood that she had handed away an empire by convincing herself it was worthless. If you believe real value hides beneath the rust, stay with Jonah as he uncovers the greatest secret in this story. Jonah Keene arrived at the Wycliffe Recovery and Metals headquarters on a Tuesday morning in October, dressed in the same worn canvas jacket he wore to every job site, carrying a folder thick with 2 years of performance records, billing statements, and letters he had never sent because he still believed the debt would be settled without attorneys. He had designed the Kestrel line sorting system from the ground up, spending 14 months testing alloy separation thresholds, recalibrating conveyor speeds, and teaching Wycliffe's floor operators every quirk and failure point of the machinery he had built. The system had outperformed every benchmark the company had set, accelerating their scrap classification by 60%, cutting annual labor costs by millions, and landing Wycliffe a state-level recycling contract worth more than the original development budget. According to the agreement Jonah had signed 2 years earlier, he was owed $2,400,000 in design fees and performance bonuses, a number that Celeste Wycliffe's own accounting department had confirmed in writing 3 separate times. He had driven the 90 minutes from his home in silence, not because he was nervous, but because he had learned over decades that the moments before a difficult conversation were better spent reviewing what he knew rather than rehearsing what he planned to say. Jonah Keene was 50 years old, had raised his daughter alone since she was 8, had never once described himself as exceptional at anything, and had built his reputation entirely on the ability to see working potential in objects and systems that other people had already classified as finished, a skill that had made him indispensable to half a dozen industrial clients, and that Celeste had exploited without any apparent intention of compensating him for it. Celeste received him in a conference room that overlooked the plant floor, where Jonah's Kestrel machines were still running, their sorting arms moving in exactly the rhythm he had programmed them to follow. She did not offer him coffee, did not acknowledge the folder he set on the table, and opened the conversation by explaining that the company was experiencing a cash flow challenge that made immediate payment impossible, but that she had a more creative resolution prepared. Her legal director, Preston Vale, slid a document across the table describing a property called Iron Vale Salvage, a decommissioned industrial yard spanning nearly 30 acres on the western edge of Greyhaven, which a Wycliffe subsidiary had held for several years, and which the company's own appraisal placed at a value of $2,600,000. The offer was straightforward: take the property, and the debt was considered paid in full, with $200,000 in surplus that Celeste described as goodwill. Jonah's daughter Audrey, who had insisted on attending as his paralegal assistant, leaned close and said quietly that Celeste never voluntarily transferred something worth more than what she owed, and that the surplus in the stated valuation was the first signal that the arithmetic was not designed to favor them. Preston applied pressure without making it sound like pressure, noting that any legal challenge to the original contract would take years, cost Jonah a significant portion of the outstanding amount in attorney fees, and proceed against a firm that employed 18 in-house counsel. Jonah understood the geometry of the situation clearly and asked for a single modification to the proposed terms. The contract would specify that every object, structure, or material on or beneath the property transferred with the land, that Wycliffe surrendered all claims and future rights of recovery, and that the debt was acknowledged as fully and completely satisfied by this one transfer. Preston agreed without hesitation, clearly expecting those words to protect Celeste from environmental liability rather than bind her to a transfer far more comprehensive than she had contemplated. The documents were signed before 4 in the afternoon, and Celeste made her remark in front of 3 vice presidents who smiled at the right moment, because that is what people in rooms like that one do. Jonah folded his copy of the contract, placed it in the same canvas folder, and walked to the elevator without looking back toward the window where the Kestrel machines were still running, because he had spent his entire career working in the spaces between what people said and what they had actually examined. The drive to Iron Vale took 40 minutes, and by the time Jonah and Audrey reached the property, the afternoon light had turned the rusted gate a particular shade of orange that was either atmospheric or instructive depending on how the next few days unfolded, and neither of them said anything about it because some observations are best left to stand on their own. The 30-acre yard was worse than the appraisal photographs had suggested. Several rows of crushed vehicle bodies had partially collapsed into each other. The drainage channels along the eastern fence line had been blocked for years and turned the lowest section into a leachate field, and the main processing building had lost most of its roof to a storm that no one had repaired. 2 storage sheds along the northern edge bore hazardous material placards, and several sealed drums visible from the access road showed the kind of surface corrosion that precedes active leaking. Audrey pulled up the county environmental registry and spent 40 minutes cross-referencing the property record against the appraisal, finding that the contaminated soil area had been classified in the report as a future remediation opportunity rather than a current liability, which was the kind of phrasing that moved cleanup cost out of the asset column without ever mentioning the figure. The preliminary estimate she pulled from a publicly available industrial remediation database suggested that addressing the leachate field alone would run between $900,000 and $1,400,000 before testing the drums or assessing the structures. Audrey turned to her father and told him Celeste had not paid the debt. She had transferred the debt onto a piece of land and handed him the invoice. Jonah did not react the way she expected, because he had already decided that retreat was not available, and that the only viable direction was forward through the problem itself. He told her they were not going to litigate the contract, and they were not going to surrender the property to unpaid taxes and regulatory fines, because both of those outcomes were precisely what Celeste had designed the situation to produce. Within 3 days, he had contacted 6 former colleagues and 2 retired machine operators who trusted his judgment enough to work on deferred payment, and the group began the methodical work of separating copper wire from structural steel, identifying salvageable hydraulic equipment, pulling working motors from crushed chassis, and clearing the sections of the property that posed no environmental complication from the sections that did. The first week generated a modest but sufficient amount from copper recovery and a working industrial press that a regional dealer purchased on the spot, enough to maintain utilities and temporary fencing, and to demonstrate to the county inspector who came by that the new owner was actively managing the site rather than abandoning it. Jonah also found, during the initial survey, more than a dozen sealed drums bearing old Wycliffe subsidiary codes that had been partially painted over. He photographed each one before moving them, because he had learned that evidence has a way of disappearing when people realize it is relevant. Celeste called on the 6th day, framed the conversation as a courtesy check, and before ending it offered to purchase the property back at $300,000 if Jonah found the remediation burden more than he wanted to carry. Jonah thanked her for the call and declined, and when he hung up, he told Audrey that a person who had insisted a property was worth $2,600,000 would not offer a quarter of that figure 6 days later, unless she had a specific reason to want it back. On the 4th day of work, while directing the removal of a collapsed vehicle stack along the yard's central corridor, Jonah's pry bar caught the edge of a large steel panel buried under 3 feet of compressed scrap, and the panel did not flex or ring the way structural sheet metal does. It produced a deep, hollow resonance that told him something large and enclosed was below it. He brushed away the surface rust and saw a logo pressed into the steel in low relief. A stylized letter D with outstretched wings, faded but legible, and he recognized it because his father Raymond had kept a small version of it mounted above his work table for the last 20 years of his life, the emblem of Davenport Motor Works, the Michigan coach builder that had gone bankrupt in 1992 after a financial scandal destroyed the company's backers almost overnight. For the first time since signing the papers in Wycliffe's conference room, Jonah Keene stood completely still. He and Audrey searched the county building permit archive that evening and found no record of any underground structure at the Iron Vale property address, which meant either it had been built before consistent permit tracking or someone had deliberately kept it off the official record, and the absence of documentation on a structure of any significant size was not an oversight, it was a decision. They borrowed a ground-penetrating scanner from a retired surveyor Jonah knew, and the results confirmed a sealed chamber running roughly 60 feet along the western axis of the yard, sitting approximately 12 feet below the surface, with walls dense enough to suggest reinforced concrete. An old power conduit ran from the site's main generator housing to a junction box mounted beneath the steel panel, and Jonah spent the better part of an afternoon tracing the line, testing insulation at each point, and confirming that the wiring would carry a low-voltage test current without risk. When he restored power and located the hydraulic valve assembly concealed beneath a secondary layer of packed earth, he found the mechanism badly seized from years of disuse but not irreparably so. 3 hours of careful disassembly, replacement of 2 rotted hydraulic lines from parts in the yard's own stockpile, and a patient restart of the pump motor brought the system back to life with a groan that traveled up through the ground and into the soles of his boots. The steel panel rose slowly, shedding decades of compacted grime, and the ramp that appeared below descended into darkness at a gentle angle, wide enough to accommodate large vehicles, which was not a dimension consistent with anything a standard scrapyard operation would require. The air inside was cool and dry in a way that outdoor adjacent spaces are not, and the hum of a mechanical ventilation system running on a separate generator confirmed that whoever had sealed this chamber had intended for what was inside it to survive a very long time. At the bottom of the ramp, arranged side by side in the far wall's light, were 5 transport containers marked with stenciled identifiers running from D01 through D05, and mounted near the base of the ramp was a metal placard that read, "Property in Preservation, Davenport Motor Works, not for destruction," followed by a signature in aged but entirely legible ink. Audrey photographed everything before either of them touched a latch, and when Jonah finally opened the first container, he lifted back an oilcloth to reveal a silver automobile with hand-formed bodywork that no factory floor had ever produced in volume. No commercial chassis number, many of its components clearly fabricated by individual craftsmen rather than stamped from production tooling, wearing the Davenport crest on its hood in enamel that had not faded in 30 years of sealed storage. All 5 containers held vehicles, each different in color, engine configuration, and interior detail, and an archived press search confirmed they matched every described detail of the 5 Davenport Sovereign prototypes reported destroyed in a warehouse fire in 1992. Jonah crouched beneath the first car and ran his flashlight along the undercarriage welds until he found what he had quietly been looking for since he recognized the hood emblem. 2 initials hand-cut into the frame rail. R.K., Raymond Keene, his father's mark, pressed into a machine the world had been told no longer existed. In a storage drawer mounted inside the ramp housing, wrapped in the same oilcloth, he found a logbook with his father's name on the first page alongside dozens of other workers. Welders, machinists, upholsterers, engineers, each listed with their assigned component, and a notation of hours contributed before the factory closed. The last entry was in a different, older hand. Do not let the people who only see the price of metal take apart what we made together. Jonah sat in the chamber for a long time after reading it, not because he was calculating anything, but because the weight of what had been preserved here, and why, was the kind of thing that settled into a person slowly. Audrey traced the names in the logbook against available records and located Empett Shaw in a small town several hours northeast of Greyhaven, a man who had managed Iron Vale's operations for more than 4 decades before the yard closed, and who had taken considerable steps to remain difficult to find afterward. When she called, he refused to speak on the phone. When she drove to his address and showed him a photograph of the ramp and the Davenport placard, he closed the door and did not reopen it for 20 minutes. What changed his mind was the photograph of Raymond Keene's initials on the Sovereign Silver's frame rail, because Emmett had watched Raymond put them there on the last night before the cars were sealed, and that specific detail was not something that could be fabricated or inferred from public sources. Emmett returned to Iron Vale and spent 2 full days walking the property before he would speak at length, observing how Jonah's crew handled the machinery, watching how Jonah negotiated with the county inspector who came to assess the drainage, noting what Jonah actually did when he believed no one was paying attention, and making a private determination about whether this particular new owner was the kind of person Silas Davenport had in mind when he asked Raymond and the others to trust in the possibility of the right person arriving eventually. The account Emmett finally gave was straightforward in its outline. After Davenport Motor Works collapsed in 1992, the bankruptcy creditors had planned to disassemble the 5 Sovereign prototypes and sell the aluminum, engine blocks, and specialized tooling separately, which would have generated perhaps $40,000 total and eliminated the only physical evidence the cars had ever existed. Silas Davenport had arranged with Raymond and a small group of trusted workers to move the cars to Iron Vale under the cover of routine scrap transport, seal them below the yard in a preservation chamber designed to hold for decades, and trust that whoever eventually owned the property and found what was inside it would understand what it was and what it represented. After Silas died, Iron Vale changed hands several times through subsidiary companies, and no subsequent owner had known the chamber existed because Emmett had removed it from the operational maps himself, deliberately, because he had twice watched new ownership regimes conduct the kind of property survey that ends with valuable material being sold and workers being ignored. Emmett led them to a second locked room adjacent to the ramp housing, and inside were the original design drawings for all 5 Sovereigns, the engine specification files, the casting molds for the Davenport crest, unprocessed test footage from the 1991 prototype trials, a deed of preservation document naming the lawful owner of Iron Vale as the legal inheritor of all preserved assets, and an operations logbook recording every vehicle that had entered the yard under cover of darkness across an 8-year span. The vehicles in those nighttime entries did not belong to Silas Davenport. They belonged, as the subsidiary fleet markings made clear, to a company whose name Audrey had been reading in regulatory documents for the past several days. Emmett also delivered a warning. The moment the existence of the sovereigns became known beyond a small, contained circle, Jonah would have no quiet days left on the property. Because what had been found was not simply valuable. It was the kind of discovery that attracted the particular species of interest that does not take no for an answer and does not distinguish clearly between acquiring something and simply removing the obstacle between itself and the thing it wants. That warning proved accurate within 48 hours. Audrey had arranged authentication through an independent appraiser under a confidentiality agreement she believed was properly contained, but one member of the appraiser's staff apparently understood that the first person to confirm the sovereign's existence to the right buyer would realize more value from that single phone call than from several months of salaried work. By the following morning, word had moved through the collector network with the efficiency of information that carries a price tag, and Jonah's phone began ringing before he had finished his first cup of coffee. Augustus Carrington called first, offering $30 million for all 5 vehicles before authentication was complete, with the condition of immediate transfer and a non-disclosure agreement preventing any public discussion of the vault, the sale, or the provenance of the cars. Helena Rothwell's offer of $45 million came packaged with a proposal to reconstitute the Davenport brand under her luxury holdings group, producing a small annual run of new vehicles at a price that treated the workers' legacy as heritage branding while returning nothing to their families. Victor Ashcroft did not name a figure in his opening contact, but asked immediately for access to the Sovereign Blue's drive-by-wire control documentation, describing it as representing 30 years of unexplored development that his own engineering team had only recently begun approaching from a different direction. Malcolm Sterling was direct. The Iron Vale rail spur's grandfathered right-of-way connecting to the Port District corridor was the reason he had sent representatives to Greyhaven, and the cars themselves were, in his unvarnished assessment, secondary to that fact. Beatrice Lockwood's proposal for a heritage museum and documentary film sounded generous until Audrey read the underlying terms, which granted Lockwood's production company perpetual commercial rights to the images and documented stories of every named worker without any compensation mechanism for their families. Jonah declined all 5 offers and announced that he would conduct no private negotiations, move no vehicle before formal title verification was complete, and accept no offer that did not include preservation conditions for the worker's historical record. All 5 parties responded by sending their full contingents, attorneys, appraisers, consultants, and vehicles, to the Iron Vale Gate simultaneously on the 14th morning after Jonah had signed the transfer agreement, and the image of those convoys queued outside a junkyard fence circulated on the regional news broadcasts before the morning was over. Wycliffe's legal notice arrived by courier that same afternoon, asserting 5 distinct claims: that the sovereign prototypes had not been specifically included in the transfer agreement and therefore could not have been transferred, that the omission of assets of such value constituted grounds to reform the contract under mutual mistake, that Jonah's retention of the vehicles constituted wrongful possession of property that had never legitimately changed ownership, that the opening of the underground chamber without environmental assessment may have violated site regulations, and that Wycliffe retained residual rights to any asset not affirmatively enumerated in the transfer documentation. Celeste held a press conference the following morning at which she described Jonah as a contractor attempting to exploit an administrative gap, framing herself as acting to protect Greyhaven's industrial heritage, a choice of language that required some effort to deliver given what was recorded in the logbook Audrey had locked in a fireproof case. Preston had drafted the transfer agreement with categorical language intended to insulate Wycliffe from all environmental liability. The transfer conveyed all structures, objects, and fixtures on and below the property, known and unknown, and the transferring party surrendered all rights of recovery and adjustment regardless of any subsequent change in ascertained value. Audrey had read that language before the signing and had noted it carefully, because a contract that transferred all downside risk onto Jonah necessarily transferred all upside benefit onto Jonah as well, and no court would read the word unknown as protective of one party against a liability while simultaneously protecting the other party against an asset. Preston knew this, which was why his subsequent instructions, delivered through a paralegal aide whose communications Audrey's attorney later obtained, had been to find a procedural argument rather than a substantive one, because the substantive argument did not exist. Celeste arrived at Iron Vale on an evening, when the gate guard had briefly stepped away and when Audrey was at the county recorder's office, timing that was consistent with surveillance of Jonah's movements. She offered $10 million, full site remediation at Wycliffe's expense, and a paid consulting arrangement if Jonah would sign a new agreement returning the property and agreeing not to disclose anything discovered in the vault. Jonah asked her why a woman who had publicly described the yard as an iron mountain of someone else's problems would personally drive there on a weeknight to negotiate its value, and Celeste told him he was operating against the resources of people whose capacity for patience and pressure was categorically larger than his own. He told her he had worked beside industrial machinery his whole life, and understood that the safest position was never inside the moving parts, but always at the access point where a person could see what was turning and decide precisely when to reach in. After Celeste left, Audrey found that one of the storage cases holding logbook copies had been shifted from its marked position, and the camera record identified the individual responsible as a member of a security company that Wycliffe's own legal team had recommended to Jonah's attorney as a reliable local resource, a recommendation that now read as an installation rather than a favor. Jonah held the individual meetings with each of the 5 interested parties that he had been delaying, sitting across from them without mediators and without the conversational framing that professional negotiators use to make a room feel collaborative when the interests are not. Augustus Carrington's vision was of 5 cars rotating through climate-controlled private storage, displayed at invitation-only occasions where their existence confirmed the owner's position rather than honored the work of the people who had made them. Helena Rothwell's reconstituted Davenport would cost more than most people earned in a lifetime, and would carry the names of Michigan factory workers as luxury provenance, their labor repurposed as heritage branding without any mechanism returning value to their families. Victor Ashcroft wanted the Sovereign Blue's control architecture locked into a patent filing that would prevent competitors from building on the same principles, and the workers' attribution documentation was, in his framing, a complication rather than an obligation. Malcolm Sterling acknowledged without embarrassment that the rail spur was his primary object, and the cars were of limited personal relevance to his acquisition rationale. Beatrice Lockwood's museum proposal incorporated every preservation phrase Jonah had stated as a requirement, but embedded commercial rights language that would have made her production company the primary beneficiary of the workers' legacy in perpetuity, with no compensation path to their families. An intermediary representing an unnamed party delivered an offer of $120 million contingent on immediate transfer, a non-disclosure agreement covering the environmental logbook, surrender of all copies of the operational records, no cooperation with any investigative agency, and permission for the acquiring party to restrict or destroy portions of the technical archive at their discretion. Audrey brought the offer to her father with full honesty, acknowledging it was the largest figure any legitimate buyer was likely to state, and that refusing it required a reason capable of surviving years of consequences rather than days of attention. Jonah told her that a person who traded Celeste's version of power for a different person's version of power had not freed himself from anything. He had simply updated the name of the institution deciding what he was worth. His auction conditions were not subject to revision. All 5 vehicles would be restored rather than disassembled or stored privately. A named worker attribution system would be embedded in every asset sold. 1 car would remain on permanent public display in Greyhaven. The rail spur would serve local transport needs under a community access covenant. The environmental records would be transferred separately to regulatory authorities and not absorbed into the transaction, and the acquiring party would fund full site remediation as a closing condition. Before the week ended, Audrey also identified the source of the authentication leak, a contracted insurance assessor who had passed partial documentation to a collector's broker, and in reviewing the payment records around that transaction, she found a secondary transfer that traced to Preston Vale's personal accounts, along with draft communications suggesting he had been building a documented record of Celeste's decisions for several months, apparently preparing to use it as a personal insurance policy if the situation deteriorated past a point he could manage from his current position. The logbook that Emmett had preserved recorded more than 300 separate nighttime deliveries across 8 years, and the cross-referencing work that Audrey and Emmett completed over 4 days identified a pattern with no ambiguity. Wycliffe Industries had transported industrial chemical waste to Iron Vale on a recurring schedule, recorded those shipments internally as general ferrous material, filed regulatory reports during the same period, affirming that no hazardous disposal had occurred at the site, and obtained clean compliance certifications based on those false filings. Certifications that qualified the company for state recycling contracts worth several $100 million in aggregate. Celeste's signature appeared on 14 of the compliance affidavits, each a formal legal attestation that the company's disposal practices met applicable standards. Audrey photographed every page twice, stored copies on separate devices, and filed a regulatory referral with the State Environmental Enforcement Division before telling anyone outside the immediate team what she had found. Preston sent a handwritten note to the yard office through a courier, offering in carefully non-incriminating language to provide documentation of the decision chain behind the environmental filings. If Audrey could arrange an immunity discussion with the state attorney's office before charges were filed, she forwarded it without response to her attorney and to the enforcement division, because the note itself was a piece of evidence and responding to it was a different activity from submitting it. Celeste's response to the regulatory referral was to petition for an emergency court order suspending all activity at Iron Vale on the grounds that the underground vault represented an unpermitted excavation at a potentially contaminated site, a maneuver that, if successful, would have frozen the auction and given Wycliffe's legal team time to build an alternative theory of the property's history. Jonah commissioned an independent environmental assessment 48 hours before the hearing, and the team he engaged produced documentation identifying every contamination source on the property, confirming that an impermeable concrete barrier physically separated the vault from the contaminated soil above it, establishing that no measurable cross-contamination had occurred in the preservation chamber, and cataloging the specific container codes matching Wycliffe's own subsidiary records on the drums found nearest the fence line. The judge who reviewed both filings denied the injunction, and noted for the record that the primary contamination risk identified in the independent assessment appeared to originate with entities other than the current property owner, and Preston submitted an affidavit that same afternoon acknowledging that the transfer agreement's language had been designed to move all environmental liability onto Jonah, that Celeste had personally approved that language, and that the same terms intended to burden the new owner with the site's contamination history had also unconditionally transferred every preserved asset in the vault to his sole ownership without reservation. The auction was held at Iron Vale on a Thursday morning, with the 5 sovereign prototypes brought up the ramp for the first time in more than 30 years, and positioned under portable lighting on clean concrete, each one displaying a placard listing the names of the workers who had contributed to its construction. The families of Raymond Keene and 11 other workers who had died in the intervening decades were present, as were 4 surviving workers who had been in their 20s when the cars were sealed away and were now in their 60s, standing near the ramp entrance with Emmett Shaw, who had said almost nothing all morning but whose expression was the expression of a man who had carried something very heavy for a very long time and been permitted at last to set it down. Celeste's legal team arrived 90 minutes before the scheduled start with a court document asserting that a mortgage held by an entity called Wycliffe Land Holdings created a security interest in the property predating Jonah's acquisition, and that the property could not be sold without that entity's consent. Audrey produced the dissolution certificate showing that Wycliffe Land Holdings had been voluntarily wound down 12 years earlier, the lien release document confirming the mortgage had been extinguished at the same time, bearing Celeste's own notarized signature, and a recorded deed entry at the county assessor's office that had been publicly accessible throughout. The copy submitted by Celeste's team was missing its final page, the page containing the lien release, and Audrey also had in her possession a message from Wycliffe's internal legal system in which Celeste had directed Preston to locate any document capable of creating delay for the buyer, time-stamped 4 days before the mortgage filing. The court liaison reviewing the competing materials made a finding within the hour that the submitted instrument had been materially altered, declined to impose any delay, and referred the matter to the district attorney's office for review. Preston, who was present and who had apparently decided sometime that week that the trajectory of the proceeding was no longer one he wished to be positioned against, confirmed to the liaison on the record that the document had been modified at Celeste's direction, that he had prepared the modification, and that he had retained the unaltered originals outside the firm's systems precisely because he had anticipated this conversation. Celeste said loudly from near the gate that Jonah had engineered the entire situation around assets he had known were present before signing the agreement, and Jonah walked toward her at a calm and unhurried pace, stopped at an appropriate distance, and said that he had not chosen Iron Vale. She had chosen it for him, had determined its stated value herself, had drafted the contract through her own legal director, had surrendered every right of recovery in language her own firm had written to protect her from a different liability, and that what he had done was the one thing he had always done, which was to look more carefully than other people had been willing to at something they had already decided was not worth the examination. The opening bid was placed at $40 million, and the next offer arrived before the first bidder had set down his card. And within the first 8 minutes the figure had moved past $60 million as Augustus and Helena bid in rapid alternation, each one attempting to establish a gap large enough to discourage the field before the room recognized that neither of them would stop until the number reached a level of personal discomfort rather than commercial calculation. Victor entered the bidding when the price crossed $68 million, and his increments were larger and more deliberate in a way that communicated he was not racing but calculating, treating the process as a mechanism for extracting each other buyer's maximum before placing his own. Malcolm's interest sharpened when the rail spur documentation was formally introduced as part of the asset package at $72 million, adding to the competition a buyer whose valuation rested on an entirely different underlying logic than the vehicles or the brand, which is the condition under which prices in a room become genuinely unpredictable. Beatrice's participation was measured until $90 million, when her increments increased in a way suggesting she had calculated that the documentary and institutional value of the acquisition was highest if it could be framed as the defining transaction rather than a near miss. At $95 million, Augustus stepped back and spoke briefly with his advisor in a register that indicated he had reached the point where winning required terms about public display that were structurally incompatible with his model of what a private collection is for, and his withdrawal from the bidding simplified the final competition considerably. Helena and Victor exchanged 3 words and indicated simultaneously that they were bidding as a consortium, and the consortium's offer of $99 million came with a written acceptance of all conditions Jonah had specified: full mechanical restoration of all 5 prototypes, permanent display of the sovereign silver in Greyhaven, a documentation trust established in the names of every worker in the logbook, full environmental remediation of Iron Vale funded by the acquiring consortium, a community access covenant attached to the rail spur in perpetuity, and a historical archive maintained on site that would not be subject to commercial alteration by the new owners. Jonah accepted and requested that the conditions be attached to the closing documents as binding covenants rather than aspirational language, and the consortium's attorneys agreed without objection or modification of any kind. Celeste, who had been standing outside the fence watching through the gate for the duration of the proceedings, approached afterward and suggested that if Jonah provided the environmental logbook to her directly, she could help prevent the litigation that was otherwise unavoidable. He told her that $99 million could transfer a junkyard, 5 automobiles, a manufacturing archive, and a set of transportation rights, but that the logbook had already left Iron Vale that morning in the hands of the State Environmental Enforcement Division, and there was no price she could name that would have changed the sequence in which those 2 events occurred. 1 year after the signing, Iron Vale bore little resemblance to the place where Jonah had stood in October, light reading the terms of his own arranged dispossession, and the change was not only physical, the remediated soil, the restored buildings, the new signage, but structural, because the site now had a purpose it had not possessed the year before, and purpose changes a place more durably than any renovation. The Davenport Museum occupied the eastern section and held 4 of the 5 sovereign prototypes in rotation, displaying them alongside the original design drawings, the casting molds, the test documentation, and a permanent installation listing every worker who had contributed to the car's construction, with biographical panels for those whose families had provided information and deliberately blank panels for those still being located, because Audrey had decided that an incomplete record honestly presented was more truthful than a completed one assembled from assumption. The sovereign silver stood at the center of the main gallery in Greyhaven under its own dedicated light, with Raymond Keene's initials visible through a mounted magnifier at eye level, positioned so that any person who wanted to see them could. The financial outcome was applied in a sequence Jonah and Audrey had worked out over several evenings at the yard office table. All outstanding liens, taxes, and remediation costs were settled first. The workers' documentation trust was funded at the level the auction covenants specified. Families of workers exposed to contamination during the years of Wycliffe's nighttime deliveries were identified through the logbook and offered settlement through a process administered by the state, and a vocational training center focused on precision metalwork and industrial restoration was established in the former processing building using equipment sourced from the yard's own recovered inventory. The state environmental enforcement proceeding that followed the logbook submission ended with Wycliffe Recovery and Metals entering a consent agreement requiring remediation payments, a compliance monitor, and a suspension of government contracting eligibility for 3 years, while the parallel investigation into the fraudulent mortgage filing and the falsified affidavits produced outcomes that removed Celeste from the company's leadership and initiated a financial recovery process against her personally. Jonah made no public statement about any of it and declined every interview that framed the situation as a personal victory over a specific adversary because he had told Audrey the morning after the auction that satisfaction built entirely on another person's destruction was an unstable foundation, and he had already poured too much of his working life into things that were built to last. Preston cooperated with authorities, but still answered for the documents he had prepared and submitted, because cooperation and accountability were not, in the court's view, mutually exclusive conditions. In the last quiet afternoon before the museum opened, Audrey found the old metal sign from Raymond Keene's work table mounted on the wall of the new workshop. No such thing as scrap iron, only iron that hasn't found its next purpose, and she stood in front of it, thinking about the woman who had smiled while her father signed a document she was certain would finish him, and about the single miscalculation large enough to explain everything that followed. Celeste had looked at Jonah Keene and seen a man who could be handed a rusted gate and a bankruptcy sentence, when what was standing in front of her was the one kind of person who would walk through that gate and ask, without any expectation of what he might find, what was still worth keeping.
Welcome in. Benjamin, welcome in. How y'all doing today? What's up, Nick De Los Santos? How you doing? What's up, KD? How you doing, bro? How's your day going? How's everyone doing today? All right. Let's get it. There we go. So, Riley, how you doing? Good morning to you, bro. How you doing? How's your day going? Chilling with my sister, about to finish cooking. Nice, bro. What'd you cook up today? What's up, Jules? Welcome in. How you doing? How's your day going?